Rajdeep Kaur was the kind of woman who didn't just speak about devotion, she lived it. For over 4 decades, she served as a Sikh nun in a quiet rural town, nestled in British Columbia, Canada, just north of the U.S. border. Her life followed the rhythm of prayer service and stillness shaped by the teachings of Guru Nanak and the wisdom of the Guru Granth Sahib. She was up every morning by 4:30 a.m., long before the sun rose over the tree-covered hills behind the Gurdwara. Her day began with Japji Sahib recited in a whisper barely louder than breath, the same prayer she had said since she was a child. With her worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Rajdeep would sit cross-legged by the east window of her room and let the early light stream over her face. She said that was when she felt closest to the divine, before the noise of the world began, when the earth still seemed to be listening. Her routine was sacred not out of ritualism but reverence. After her morning meditations, she would tie up her silver-streaked hair beneath her turban, roll up her sleeves and head out to the community garden behind the Gurdwara. There she tended to the herbs, peppermint, tulsi, lavender, and golden calendula that she used to make teas and poultices for the sick and the elderly. It was her way of embodying Seva, selfless service, a central tenet of Sikh faith. People in the community, many of them immigrants, truck drivers, farmers, and retirees, looked up to her not just as a religious leader but as a figure of quiet strength. She remembered names, asked about people's children, sat beside hospital beds, and stayed late in the kitchen after the langar to make sure the last widow in the corner had eaten. Rajdeep believed with all her heart that God Waguru dwelt in every soul. She saw the spark of the divine in the eyes of the beggar as much as the scholar. Her faith was inclusive, patient, and generous. She had studied the holy texts deeply and believed that all religions contained some truth. But she also believed that Sikhism was the clearest path to spiritual fulfillment. Jesus, in her understanding, was a wise teacher, even a prophet, but not divine. The idea of salvation by grace felt distant from the Sikh emphasis on karma and dharma. You sow, you reap. You serve, you grow. That was the rhythm of life she trusted. And yet beneath her composed exterior, Rajdeep occasionally felt a restlessness that she could not explain. It wasn't doubt exactly, more like a yearning. A quiet voice that sometimes stirred during her long evening meditations, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something she hadn't yet understood. But she had spent a lifetime teaching others to be still, so she silenced it. When a Christian friend once gifted her a Bible during an interfaith event, she accepted it out of respect, brought it home and tucked it in the corner of her bookshelf. It gathered dust for years. She never imagined how suddenly everything would change. One morning during early spring, Rajdeep walked out barefoot into the dew-soaked garden as she had done 1,000 times before. The tulsi plants had begun to bloom, and the bees had returned to the garden. She was gently clipping sprigs of mint when her hand brushed too close to a hidden wasp nest nestled beneath the fence post. Before she could move, a large yellowjacket lunged forward and stung her at the base of her neck. At first it was just a sharp pain. Then came the dizziness, the tightness in her chest, the shortness of breath. She staggered back, clutching her throat. Her vision blurred. The world around her grew faint and began to spin. By the time the younger sisters found her collapsed near the rose bushes, her lips were turning blue. An ambulance was called. The paramedics did everything they could. But on the way to the hospital, Rajdeep's heart stopped. For 11 minutes, she was clinically dead. And during those 11 minutes, she experienced something that no prayer, no meditation, no ritual had ever prepared her for. She would later describe it as slipping through a veil, not a curtain of cloth, but something more cosmic, like crossing from the shoreline into a sea of light. She left behind the scent of herbs and the sound of sirens, and entered into a realm of unspeakable stillness. A presence was there, one she had never encountered in her many years of prayer, but instantly recognized. And when she came back gasping, trembling with tears running down her face, she could no longer speak of Wahguru in the same way. Her heart had encountered Jesus, and though her lips would not form the words for days, her soul had already whispered them. He was not just a prophet, he was the truth itself. Rajdeep never remembered being resuscitated. One moment she had felt the cold grass against her back, and the sky folding in like a veil of mist, and the next she was floating, no longer bound by pain, breath, or heartbeat. It was not like fainting or falling asleep. It was as if she had slipped out of her body the way a hand slips out of a glove. She drifted upward slowly, weightlessly detached from the frail shell that had once housed her life. Below, she could see a flurry of motion. Paramedics hovered over her collapsed form, one of them pressing rhythmically on her chest, another calling out vitals. A young sister cried out, her voice cracking as she knelt beside the stretcher. Yet to Rajdeep it all seemed impossibly distant, as if it were happening behind a pane of thick glass. She should have felt terrified, but instead an unshakable calm wrapped around her like a warm quilt. There was a silence, not the absence of sound, but a stillness so profound it seemed to vibrate with meaning. Time did not move the way it did on Earth. Seconds did not tick. Rather, it felt like she had stepped outside of time entirely. Then came a hum, gentle at first, like the low sound of wind between the pines. But it grew not louder but deeper, resonating through her very being. The darkness around her was not empty. It was full, almost alive, pulsing with a sense of anticipation. That was when she noticed it, a light in the distance, impossibly soft, yet more radiant than anything she had ever seen. It didn't shine like the sun, nor glare like a fluorescent bulb. It was a living light, one that breathed, one that called, not with words, but with a pull gentle yet undeniable. She felt it not in her ears, but in her soul. She hesitated. This wasn't Wahguru. This wasn't the oneness she had spent a lifetime meditating on. There were no chants here, no rhythmic recitations of sacred verses, no visions of the 10 gurus. This was something other, something unfamiliar. Yet it was not foreign. In some deep and mysterious way, it felt like home. Rajdeep felt herself moving, though there was no ground beneath her, no wind at her back. She was simply being drawn toward the light, as if carried along by an unseen current. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, not harsh, but embracing. It enveloped everything. It wasn't just around her, it was within her. The very atoms of her being began to hum in harmony with it. She was no longer Rajdeep, the nun, the teacher, the herbalist, the caregiver. She was just soul, seen, known, and held. And then from within that sea of light she sensed a presence. At first it was just a feeling, immense kind, impossibly vast, yet intimately close. But as she moved deeper into that presence, its form began to take shape. She couldn't describe it in earthly terms. It wasn't like seeing a person walk into a room. It was more like realizing you'd been watched with love your entire life, and only now catching sight of the eyes that had watched you. Then she saw him. At first his form was veiled in radiance. The light didn't just shine on him, it came from him. But as she approached, the details became clearer. His face, radiant and weathered with compassion, was both strange and familiar. His eyes, they were everything. They looked straight through her, not just seeing her deeds, but her doubts, her regrets, her fears. And yet there was no judgment, only understanding, deep, overwhelming, merciful understanding. It was Jesus. Her heart reeled. How could this be? Jesus was not part of her theology. In Sikhism, he was a respected figure, a spiritual teacher, perhaps a wise man, but not the divine. Certainly not the embodiment of salvation. And yet there he stood, not as a prophet from ancient pages, but as a living, breathing presence wrapped in light and love and truth so pure it hurt. She wanted to speak, to ask, to explain her confusion. But before she could form a word, he spoke. "Rajdeep," he said. His voice both thunder and whisper. "Why are you here?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a question that searched her soul, like a lamp shining into a deep well. She didn't know what to say. Then, he asked again, "Who do you say I am?" The question echoed within her like a bell struck in eternity. She had spent her life answering other people's questions. But now she stood without answers. Because the truth was there, standing before her, undeniable. She wept, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition. Her soul knew him, even if her mind had not. The light, the peace, the love, none of it came from the mantras or the karma she had clung to her whole life. It came from him. "You know me," he said gently. "You've always known me." And in that moment, something cracked open inside her. A veil tore. A memory surfaced, not of a specific moment, but of a longing she had carried her entire life without ever naming. A longing to be known, not for what she had done, but for who she was. A longing to be loved without measure. A longing for grace. And now grace stood before her. The light around him pulsed with life, and she knew without being told that what she had thought of as the end was only the beginning. This was not death. This was revelation. This was invitation. And somewhere deep within her she understood she would not remain here. Not yet. There was more to come. There was something she needed to do. Something she needed to tell. But for now, all she could do was stand in the presence of the one she never expected, and whisper through tears, "Yes." Rajdeep felt the warmth of the light intensify, as though the very atmosphere around Jesus were alive and breathing. It wasn't a physical heat, but something deeper, like a radiant presence that flowed into every corner of her soul. She stood motionless, suspended in awe, as the silence around them took on a new texture, no longer empty, but filled with a holy anticipation. The presence before her, this Jesus whom she had never truly known, now looked into her with such clarity. It was as though her entire life were being played out across the screen of his gaze. But there was no condemnation, only a kind of love she had never imagined, not earned, not measured, not contingent, but given, entirely freely and without hesitation. Before Rajdeep could speak again, the light around them began to shift. It rippled gently like the surface of a lake, catching a sudden breeze, and then parted, as if unveiling another layer of truth. Without walking, without willing, Rajdeep felt herself moving forward, drawn, not by her own power, but by the momentum of something sacred. Jesus remained beside her, not as a guide in the conventional sense, but as the very source of what she was being shown. It was as if she had stepped beyond existence into revelation. And now, he was pulling back the curtain on everything she thought she knew. The first vision opened before her like a living tapestry. She found herself standing in a vast, open field, unlike any on earth. The grass shimmered, not green, but a hue she couldn't name, vibrant and radiant, alive in a way that defied comprehension. Flowers bloomed in dazzling colors that pulsed with joy. The sky above held no sun, yet light poured in from everywhere, soft and golden, as if the air itself was woven with glory. Every breath Rajdeep took filled her with a sense of purity, of belonging, of being completely known and completely safe. Then she saw them, people, souls, not as vague silhouettes or faceless figures, but real individuals, radiant with peace and joy. Some stood together, others knelt in worship. Some sang without sound, their faces illuminated from within. There was no sorrow here, no fear, no shame. Rajdeep felt their unity perfect, seamless, and sacred. She knew without needing explanation that this place was heaven. Not a myth, not a metaphor, but a reality more real than anything she had ever known. She turned to Jesus, her eyes wide with wonder. "What is this place?" she asked, though in her heart she already knew. He answered with a voice that held both gentleness and authority. "This is the fullness of God's love. A place prepared for those who accept the truth." Tears welled in Rajdeep's eyes. The truth. Not earned. Not achieved through works or meditation or mantras, but received. Given. Grace. The word pulsed through her being, resonating with the ache she had carried her whole life, the ache to be enough, to do enough, to serve enough. And here in this place she saw that the striving had never been the answer. It had always been the invitation, not to work harder, but to surrender. But just as she began to breathe in the peace of heaven, the vision changed. The light dimmed. The warmth gave way to a sudden chill. The field disappeared, and she found herself standing in a landscape stripped of life. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and dry. The air was thick with sorrow. Shadows moved in the distance, twisted, hunched figures. She couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could feel their anguish. A weeping not of lips, but of souls. There were no flames, no pitchforks, no demons. Just absence, isolation, a void where love had been rejected. Rajdeep's heart clenched. "What is this?" she whispered, not wanting to know, but needing to. Jesus stood beside her still, but his face was now grave, filled with a sorrow deeper than words. "This is what separation looks like. This is what it means when love is refused." Her eyes widened. "But how could you allow this? How could a loving God allow such grief?" He turned to her, and the pain in his eyes was unbearable. "Love cannot force. It must be chosen. This is not punishment. It is the result of a soul choosing to walk away from truth, from grace, from me." Rajdeep was silent. Her entire belief system, so long built on karma, on cause and effect, was unraveling. This was not about balance or justice or spiritual bookkeeping. This was about relationship, about invitation, about grace that must be accepted. And then Jesus turned to her again, and with a wave of his hand, another vision appeared, this time of the cross. She saw him there, not distant, not symbolic, but real, flesh torn, blood dripping, thorns pressed into his brow, and yet those eyes, still filled with love, still forgiving, still reaching out. "This is how much you are loved," he said softly. "This is what I gave so you could come home." Rajdeep fell to her knees, trembling. It was too much. The cross wasn't just a story for others, it was for her. She had spent her whole life offering prayers, preparing food, reciting scriptures. And yet in all her serving she had missed the one who served her first. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she lifted her gaze. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Why me?" He answered with a voice that resonated in her bones. "Because you seek truth, and the truth has brought you here." And there it was. The moment everything she believed cracked open. Her heart, so long dedicated to the divine through discipline and devotion, now stood face to face with the source of all that was holy. And she understood. Jesus wasn't calling her to abandon what she had cherished. He was calling her to fulfillment, to completion, to a love that required no earning and offered no guilt. Just open arms. Then Jesus reached out his hand, not to touch but to invite. She didn't feel skin. She felt light, peace, warmth. A love so overwhelming it pulled the breath from her lungs, even in spirit form. "Follow me," he said, "and I will show you the fullness of truth." Rajdeep hesitated. She thought of her community, her life, her identity. But then she thought of the eyes of those souls in the valley, and the joy in the ones in heaven. And she knew the choice was not between religions or books or labels. It was between accepting love or walking away from it. And so, trembling, unsure, and undone, she whispered yes. The light pulsed around her again, brighter this time, as if heaven itself had heard her response. And somewhere far away, but also deep within Rajdeep, felt a shift. Her journey was not ending. It was just beginning. When Rajdeep awoke, it was not with the triumph of resurrection, but with the confusion of being caught between two realities. The sterile white light of the hospital room seemed pale compared to the golden radiance she had just left behind. The buzzing machines, the quiet shuffle of rubber soles against tile, the soft voice of a nurse asking how she felt. It all seemed impossibly distant, like echoes from a life she had already laid down. Her chest ached from CPR compressions, her throat was dry, and an oxygen tube brushed her upper lip. But none of that mattered. Not really. Her body had returned, but her soul was still trembling in the aftershock of glory. Her family surrounded her, 2 younger cousins from the temple, her elderly sister from Vancouver, and 3 fellow Sikh nuns. Their faces were etched with relief, concern, and curiosity. She could see it in their eyes. They wanted to celebrate her survival, but they were also waiting for answers. What had happened in that gap of silence between the garden and the hospital? What had she seen? How had she come back? Rajdeep opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she describe the light that had no source, the love that had no boundaries, the voice that had called her by name with such tenderness that it had melted the very center of her being? How could she tell them that the Jesus she had once viewed as a teacher for other people had revealed himself to her not only as real, but as the very essence of truth, love, and salvation? In the days that followed, Rajdeep drifted between recovery and reflection. The nurses noted her remarkable calm, but they didn't know that inside she was burning with something holy. Her body was weak, but her spirit was alive in a way it had never been. She could still feel the light pulsing in her memory, still hear Jesus' voice echoing in her soul. "Follow me." The visions of heaven and hell haunted her not in fear, but in urgency. She had seen what joy looked like in the presence of God, and she had seen what sorrow came to those who turned away from grace. It was not punishment she had witnessed, but separation, and the weight of it would not let her go. Back at the temple, Rajdeep tried to return to her role, but something had changed. Everything had changed. The sacred texts that once gave her life now felt like incomplete pieces of a larger puzzle. She still loved the beauty of Sikhism, still cherished the values of Siva, humility, and equality. But now, when she knelt in meditation, it wasn't the sound of mantras that filled her ears. It was the name of Jesus. And when she opened the Guru Granth Sahib, her hands trembled not in rejection, but in a strange reverence for a path that had led her to a deeper revelation. She wasn't abandoning her roots. She was discovering what they had always pointed toward. Late one night, unable to sleep, Rajdeep walked slowly to the bookshelf in her small room. On the top shelf, behind layers of incense and wrapped prayer beads, was a dusty old Bible. It had been given to her years ago by a Methodist woman she had met during an interfaith panel in Seattle. At the time, Rajdeep had received it with politeness and tucked it away, believing it held little relevance for her own journey. But now her hands reached for it, as if it were calling her. She opened it with trembling fingers, not knowing where to begin. And her eyes fell upon a verse in the Gospel of John, one she had heard before, but never truly seen. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The words pierced through her like a light breaking through stained glass. It was exactly what he had said to her in the light, not in condemnation, but in invitation. The same voice, the same truth. She sat for hours that night, turning page after page, the stories of Jesus' life, his teachings, his healings, his sacrifice. It all rang with the same melody she had heard in that other world. It wasn't about religion or ritual. It was about relationship. It was about grace. It was about a love so vast it humbled her to the core. In the days that followed, she continued to read. Slowly at first, then with the fervor of someone thirsting in the desert. She found herself praying not just in the traditional way, but in silence, in tears, in whispers of thank you that rose from a place deeper than thought. She began writing in a private journal, not sermons, not commentaries, but personal letters to Jesus. Letters of longing, of gratitude, of confusion. And in those pages, something began to bloom, a new kind of faith, unshaped by culture or expectation. A faith born not of tradition, but of truth. But Rajdeep knew she couldn't keep this transformation to herself. One morning, as she sat on the wooden bench near the rose garden where she had collapsed just weeks before, she felt a pressing in her spirit. A sense that her encounter hadn't been for her alone. That what she had seen, what she had been shown, was meant to be shared. Still, fear crept in. What would her sisters think, her mentors, the community she had served for decades? Would they call her a traitor, a heretic? Would they believe she had lost her mind? She thought of the faces she had seen in the valley, the ones separated from the light by sorrow and regret. And then she thought of Jesus' eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her on the cross, filled with forgiveness and hope. "You've always known me," he had said. Yes, she thought. Yes, I have. That afternoon, Rajdeep made her way to the meditation hall. A few of the younger sisters were there, sweeping and preparing for evening prayer. She walked slowly to a woman named Simran, a gentle soul who had always admired Rajdeep's devotion. Simran looked up and smiled. "I thought you might rest more today," she said softly. Rajdeep sat beside her. "Simran," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I need to tell you something. Something that happened when I died." And there beneath the carved wooden beams of the Gurdwara, with incense still curling in the air, and the distant echo of scripture playing from a speaker, Rajdeep began to tell the story of her encounter not with dogma or drama, but with the quiet awe of someone who had been touched by something holy. Simran listened wide-eyed and silent, and when Rajdeep finished, she didn't recoil. She didn't argue. She only whispered, "And what happens now?" Rajdeep looked toward the setting sun through the stained glass window. Her voice was calm but resolute. "Now," she said, "I follow him." Rajdeep knew that saying yes to Jesus in the realm of light had been the easy part. It was returning to earth with that answer burning in her soul that proved far more difficult. The quiet peace she had carried back with her began to tremble beneath the weight of reality. This was not the light-filled landscape of heaven. This was the world of questions, stares, expectations, and pain. Here the name of Jesus carried history, tension, and division, and for Rajdeep it threatened to unravel everything she had once stood for: her position, her community, her very identity as a Sikh nun. She didn't rush into declarations. Instead, she moved carefully, prayerfully, choosing to confide only in those she trusted. Simran had been the first. Her openness and gentleness had given Rajdeep courage, and their late-night conversations became a sacred space where honesty was safe. But Rajdeep knew it wouldn't stop there. She couldn't keep her story locked behind closed doors, not when the truth she had encountered was still echoing through every corner of her being. It had changed her life, and it demanded to be shared. She decided to speak next with someone who had once been more than a mentor: Bhajan, an elder Sikh priest who had taught her much of what she knew. They had prayed side by side for years, studied scripture together, and served the poor in tandem. If there was anyone who might listen without immediately dismissing her, it was him. So one rainy afternoon, Rajdeep made her way to his small cottage on the edge of town. She brought no books, no notes, only her story, and a heart trembling with hope and fear. Bhajan welcomed her with his usual warmth. He poured hot masala chai, and they spoke for a while about the monsoon rains, the condition of the temple roof, and the recent medical camp. But when the small talk faded, Rajdeep took a breath and shared what had happened. She told him about the bee sting, the sudden collapse in the garden, and the stillness that followed. Then she spoke of the light, the presence, the eyes of Jesus, and the truth he had revealed to her. She described the visions of heaven and hell, the overwhelming realization of grace, and the invitation to follow him. As she spoke, Bhajan's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. His brows furrowed, his fingers tightened around the teacup, and when she finished, a heavy silence fell between them. "Rajdeep," he said slowly, "you've always been a woman of deep devotion. But this path you're describing, it is not ours." "I know," she said quietly, "but it is truth, and I cannot unsee what I've seen." Bhajan shook his head. "There are many truths, daughter. Yours does not cancel mine." "I'm not trying to cancel anything," she replied gently. "I'm trying to obey the one who called me by name. I didn't go looking for Jesus. He came for me." The conversation ended respectfully, but Rajdeep knew the wall had been built. Bhajan did not condemn her, but neither did he understand, and as she stepped back out into the drizzle, she realized something vital: this journey would be lonelier than she had imagined. In the weeks that followed, word began to spread. Some heard of her experience and came to ask sincere questions. Others approached with suspicion, hoping to catch her saying something heretical. A few simply stopped speaking to her altogether. The temple board asked to meet with her privately. They were polite, but their message was clear: if she continued to speak of Jesus, she would no longer be welcome to teach or lead prayer in the Gurdwara. It stung, but not in the way she had feared. There was grief, yes, but there was also clarity. She had not traded one religion for another. She had stepped into the fulfillment of what her faith had always longed for. The oneness she had meditated on, the grace she had only heard whispers of, the light she had sensed in her deepest moments of stillness. It all now had a name, and that name was Jesus. Still, Rajdeep grieved the losses, the faces that no longer smiled when she passed, the invitations that stopped coming, the unspoken distance between her and the community she had once served without hesitation. These were not small things. They were wounds. But in the quiet hours of the night, as she prayed with tears on her pillow, she felt the comfort of the same presence that had met her in the light. "You are not alone," the Spirit whispered, and she believed it. Not all responses were rejection. Some were surprising, even beautiful. A young man named Harpreet, who had long struggled with doubt, came to her after a community gathering. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I heard what happened to you," he said. "I've always wondered if there was more. But I was afraid to ask, afraid of what I'd lose. But now, I'm starting to believe that maybe the truth is worth the risk." Rajdeep placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is," she said. "Even if it costs you everything, it gives you everything." Encounters like that became her strength. Each honest conversation, each whispered confession from someone who was seeking reminded her that her story mattered. That she was not just a former nun, not just a strange headline in a local newsletter, but a vessel carrying light into the shadows of confusion and fear. One evening, she was invited to speak at a small interfaith circle in nearby Vancouver. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Sikhs sat in folding chairs in a modest community center. Rajdeep stood at the front, not as a preacher but as a witness. She shared her story not to convert but to testify. She spoke with gentleness, with reverence, and with unshakable conviction. "Jesus didn't ask me to abandon who I was," she told them. "He asked me to receive who he is." The room was still, and when she finished, an elderly Buddhist nun approached her, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she said softly, "but I know your peace is real." And that was enough. Rajdeep began writing again, not just in her journal, but in long-form reflections. She hoped to one day publish. She partnered with a few others who had experienced similar encounters and formed a small online group where they encouraged one another and shared their testimonies. It was not about building a movement. It was about planting seeds quietly, faithfully, one heart at a time. Her days were no longer filled with rigid schedules or temple obligations. Instead, she walked often. She spent more time in nature. She prayed in the garden where she had nearly died. And every now and then she would whisper toward the sky, "Thank you. Thank you for the sting that stopped my heart. Thank you for the love that healed my soul. Thank you for the name I never dared speak, but now will never stop saying." Jesus. Rajdeep had always believed that faith, when real, bore fruit, not just in private devotions, but in the way one lived, served, and loved. Now, more than ever, she sensed that her journey with Jesus was not meant to remain hidden in quiet corners or whispered conversations. It was a living testimony meant to be spoken aloud, even if the cost of speaking was high. What had begun as a divine encounter in the space between life and death had now blossomed into a calling, not to persuade, not to argue, but to testify. She had seen grace. She had felt its embrace. And now she had to give voice to it. The first time she stood before a larger group to share her story, her hands trembled. It wasn't a church or a formal service. It was a modest interfaith gathering hosted in a community center in the heart of Surrey, where men and women from many traditions met monthly to discuss the intersection of spirituality, peace, and service. Rajdeep had attended before as a listener, but now she was asked to speak, not as a scholar or spiritual authority, but as a woman who had died and returned with a revelation that had changed her life forever. She stood quietly at the front of the room, wearing a simple shawl over her shoulders and holding no notes. She told them about her childhood in Punjab, her journey into Sikh devotion, her life of service in the temple and among the Sikh. Then slowly she shared the moment everything changed. The bee sting, the collapse, the stillness. And then Jesus. She described his presence, the light, the invitation, and the truths he spoke to her heart. She spoke of heaven not as a far-off dream, but as a reality more vivid than anything she'd ever touched. And she spoke of hell not in fire and brimstone, but as a sorrowful distance from love, the result of rejecting the very grace that sought to embrace every soul. She expected resistance, maybe even ridicule. But what followed instead was silence. Deep, respectful silence. And then slowly questions, thoughtful, searching questions from strangers who had never dared to speak so vulnerably about their own doubts and hopes. Some had tears in their eyes. Others took her hand afterward and said, "I've never heard anyone talk about Jesus like that. It makes me wonder if I've misunderstood him all along." That night Rajdeep walked home under the stars, her heart full and trembling. She realized that there were many people who were spiritually hungry, not for religion or ritual, but for truth that was personal, embodied, and radiant with love. And the Jesus she had met in the light wasn't just calling her to follow, he was calling her to point others toward him. She began receiving invitations to speak in small churches, spiritual retreats, and even a podcast run by a Christian nurse who had experienced her own NDE years earlier. Rajdeep accepted each opportunity with humility, always reminding her audience, "I'm not here to dismantle your faith. I'm here to share what happened to me and to tell you that love is real. Grace is real. And his name is Jesus." But alongside these open doors came new challenges. Word of her public testimonies reached more conservative members of her former community. Some of her old friends stopped returning her calls. One longtime companion in temple service sent her a handwritten letter, urging her to stop confusing people with foreign ideas. It stung, not because she felt ashamed, but because she still loved these people. She had broken no promises. She had not walked away in rebellion. She had simply followed the truth that had found her in the valley between two worlds. Still, she pressed on. One Sunday afternoon, she was invited to speak at a small country church just across the U.S. border in Washington. It was a white clapboard building with a creaky wooden porch and a sanctuary that smelled faintly of hymnals and age-old dust. There were only 30 people in the pews, most of them in their 70s and 80s, retired farmers, widows, veterans, and lifelong believers. Rajdeep stood before them, unsure how a Sikh woman with a turban and a strange story would be received. But as she spoke, she watched their eyes widen, their postures lean forward, their hands reach for tissues. One elderly man, a Korean War veteran with a silver cross around his neck, wept silently as she described her vision of Jesus on the cross, his eyes still filled with love even in agony. When she spoke of hearing him say, "This is how much you are loved," the whole room went still. Afterward, the pastor, a soft-spoken man with a deep laugh, took her hands in his. "Sister," he said, "you've reminded us that the gospel isn't just a message. It's a person. And we need that reminder." In those small gatherings, Rajdeep found something she hadn't expected: a new spiritual family. They didn't all look like her, talk like her, or come from her world. But they shared the same hunger for God, the same wonder at grace, the same quiet awe at what it meant to be truly loved. They welcomed her not as an outsider, but as a sister in Christ. And in their arms, she found rest. Yet Rajdeep never turned her back on her Sikh roots. She still treasured the songs she had sung for decades, the rhythms of prayer that had trained her heart in reverence. She still visited the Gurdwara on quiet weekdays, not to preach, but to sit, to pray, to remember. And when others came and sat beside her, she didn't hide the name of Jesus. She simply shared what he had done. Some listened with skepticism, others with curiosity, but a few with tears in their eyes. As weeks turned into months, Rajdeep began to write a small book, part memoir, part reflection, part invitation. She called it Between the Light and the Garden. It was her story, not just of the sting that stopped her heart, but of the love that awakened her soul. It was a bridge built from the planks of pain, wonder, loss, and redemption. And as she wrote, she prayed not for fame, but for impact. That perhaps someone somewhere would read her words and dare to ask, what if it's true? What if he really is who he says he is? In the stillness of each morning, as the sun crept across her small apartment floor and the birds began to sing, Rajdeep would open her Bible, hold a cup of spiced chai in her hands, and whisper one word aloud: Jesus. It wasn't a mantra. It was a love song. And it was enough. By the time autumn arrived with its amber leaves and long, quiet evenings, Rajdeep had come to recognize that her journey was no longer a private spiritual awakening. It was a mission. It had begun with the soft hum of bees in a sunlit garden, and had passed through the stillness of death, the light of Christ, and the isolation of misunderstood faith. But now it was ripening into something larger, a call to help others see that truth was not confined to the boundaries of religious tradition, language, or background. It was personal living and deeply relational, and Rajdeep had been chosen not because of her worthiness, but because of her willingness to carry that truth into a world still wandering in shadows. She didn't see herself as a preacher, nor did she try to fit into the mold of a traditional Christian evangelist. She was too different, too formed by years of monastic Sikh practice, too gentle in her approach, too deliberate in her silence. But what she offered was authenticity. When Rajdeep spoke, people listened not because her voice was loud, but because it carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen beyond the veil. She didn't speak in sermons. She spoke in stories. And story, as the older folks in the audience often said, was what lingered in the heart long after facts faded. By late October, she was receiving invitations from places she'd never expected: small nursing homes, interfaith women's circles, rural churches tucked away in the hills of northern Washington, even Zoom calls with seekers from across the country. Some of the people who came to hear her were lifelong believers. Others were skeptics, and many were in that aching middle space, those who had lost their way, or who had once had faith but no longer knew how to return to it. Rajdeep didn't offer formulas. She didn't debate. She simply shared what had happened when the world went silent and her heart stopped beating. She shared what she saw, whom she met, and how grace in one eternal moment had turned her life inside out. She had also started hearing from people in her old community, some quietly, others anonymously. One was a widow named Manjeet, who had followed Rajdeep's story online and had been wrestling with guilt and shame for decades after her son had left the Sikh faith to follow Christ. Rajdeep listened with deep compassion and reminded her that God was not limited by walls or rituals. What you call guilt, she said gently, may actually be the spirit knocking. Another was a young Punjabi-American nurse from New Jersey who had secretly begun reading the New Testament after seeing one of Rajdeep's interviews on YouTube. I feel like I'm waking up, she wrote, but I'm scared of what my family will say if I speak it out loud. Rajdeep understood. She had lived in that tension herself, torn between devotion to her heritage and obedience to the Lord who had called her by name. And yet what she told others now was what she had come to know firsthand, that when Jesus invites you to follow him, he never does so with the expectation that you erase your past. Instead, he redeems it, transforms it, uses it. The river doesn't forget its source. It simply flows toward the sea. That winter, Rajdeep felt the nudge to take another step, one she had resisted but now felt ready for. She had long avoided returning to the main Gurdwara she had served in for over 20 years. Though no one had forbidden her outright, the tone of polite distancing had been clear. She wasn't sure what kind of welcome she'd receive. But as the year came to a close, she sensed that it was time not to argue, not to explain, but to be present. to show love. She arrived on a gray Sunday morning, her shawl pulled tight against the brisk wind, her heart steady but soft. She walked into the marble-floored entry, removed her shoes, washed her hands, and stepped inside with the same reverence she had known since youth. A few heads turned. Some smiled. Others looked away. But no one stopped her. She sat quietly on the side, listening to the familiar cadence of scripture being sung in Gurmukhi. The hymns were beautiful, just as they had always been. But this time something was different. The longing behind the words, the hunger for the divine, now felt like echoes of a song she had finally heard in full, and as she closed her eyes, she whispered a prayer, not for acceptance, but for mercy. That those still searching might encounter the one who had found her when she wasn't even looking. After the service, a few of the younger women approached her. Some were curious, some were cautious, but none were cruel. One of them, a college student named Gurleen, walked beside her into the garden and asked, "You really saw him, didn't you?" Jesus Rajdeep smiled gently. "I didn't just see him," she said. "He saw me." That moment opened a new chapter, not of confrontation, but of conversation. In the months that followed, Rajdeep began hosting informal gatherings in her apartment, what she called tea and truth nights. A few women from different backgrounds came to sip masala chai, ask hard questions, and read passages from both the Guru, Granth Sahib, and the Bible. There were no arguments, just gentle bridges, and laughter, and healing. Though Rajdeep no longer carried an official title, her role as a spiritual mother only deepened. In every story she told, in every tear she wiped away, she was building something that transcended tradition, a space where truth could be sought without fear. And in that space, the name of Jesus was not foreign or offensive. It was healing. She had also begun mentoring a few younger Christian women who were first-generation immigrants, helping them navigate how to honor their families while following Christ. "You don't have to be loud to be faithful," she would tell them. "You just have to be true." Now, as spring approached again, Rajdeep found herself walking through the same garden where she had once collapsed. The bee boxes were gone. The tulsi plants were taller. And life, unexpected, abundant life, was blooming everywhere. She knelt down by the mint patch, touched a leaf to her lips, and let her eyes close. The world had changed. She had changed. But the light she had encountered that day in eternity still burned inside her. And wherever she went now, whether in temples or churches, community centers, or small living rooms, she carried that light not like a torch, but like a candle, steady, quiet, unwavering. And she knew without a doubt that her mission was not to convert, but to invite. Not to speak over, but to walk with. Not to claim, but to testify. The truth had found her in the most unlikely moment. And now she would spend the rest of her life helping others see that it might be looking for them too. Rajdeep never returned to life as it had been before the garden, before the sting, before the silence that had ushered her into eternity. Something in her soul had been rewritten, not erased, not replaced, but illuminated. It was as if the story she thought she had finished writing had revealed hidden ink that only the light of Christ could make visible. And now, each step she took, each word she spoke, each breath she offered to the morning air was part of a new chapter. One not built on striving or religious obligation, but on relationship, on grace, on love unearned and freely given. She remained in many ways the same woman. She still drank chai in the early dawn, still prayed with reverence, still listened more than she spoke, still wore her turban with quiet dignity. But the fire in her spirit was different. It didn't burn out of duty, it burned from delight. the kind of holy delight that comes from being seen, known, and chosen by the one who shaped the stars and still whispers your name in the quiet of night. Rajdeep continued to walk gently between worlds. She never disowned her Sikh heritage, nor did she treat it as something to be discarded. Instead, she honored it as the path that had prepared her feet to follow the one who had come for her. She spoke of Jesus not as a stranger from another faith, but as the fulfillment of a lifelong search for the divine. And in doing so, she built bridges where others only saw borders. To some, she was still a mystery. To others, a quiet scandal. But to many, especially to those who had felt invisible in their spiritual hunger, Rajdeep became a light in the dark. A woman who had died and returned, not to argue theology, but to embody the gentle authority of a life touched by God. In her final years, she published her book, Between the Light and the Garden, which slowly found its way into homes, hospitals, and hearts across the country. Not a bestseller, but a soul stirrer. Something to be underlined, cried over, passed along. In it she wrote, "I don't claim to know all things, but I know this: when I died, I met the truth. And he knew my name. He knew my story. And he loved me anyway. That's grace. That's Jesus. And he's more real than anything this world could offer." She passed peacefully in her sleep one spring morning, surrounded by blooming jasmine and a well-worn Bible on her nightstand. No drama, no fear, just silence and light. At her memorial, people of all faiths came. Some wore turbans, others held rosaries, and a few stood with hands open, unsure of what they believed, but certain they had been touched by the life of a woman who had walked in two worlds and made both feel holy. A young Christian pastor spoke, followed by an elder Sikh woman, then a Buddhist nun, then a retired nurse. Each one testified not to theology, but to transformation. Rajdeep had lived her final years not trying to convince others, but to love them toward truth. She understood what many missed, that grace does not shout, it whispers. It does not conquer, it invites. And it does not come to those who earn it, but to those who simply open their hands. Her life had been interrupted by death, but her death had been interrupted by love. And now, long after her heartbeat had stopped for the last time, the ripple of her story continued. In the late-night prayers of seekers, in the quiet tears of skeptics, in the bold steps of those who dared to follow a voice they couldn't explain. Rajdeep Kaur had once thought she knew the way, but when she met the way, she followed him, and found life not only beyond the veil, but here, now, and forever.